The week after my grandmother died, my parents took everything. The accounts, the jewelry, the family trust that everyone knew Grandma had built over 40 years. All that was left for me was a house no one wanted. An old wooden place on Birch Hollow Road in Astoria, Oregon. The roof sagged, the wiring was condemned years ago, and the yard had turned into waist-high weeds. My father said it was the only thing I could reasonably manage. At the time, I believed that was the end of the story. A week later, at 10:12, on a Tuesday night, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Evan Rios, the contractor I'd hired 2 days earlier to look at the house. When I answered, he didn't greet me the way people usually do. His voice was tight, controlled. "Lena, you should come out here." I sat up straighter on the couch in my small Eugene apartment. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. Not a normal pause. The kind where someone is deciding how much to say. "We opened part of the living room wall," he said. "And there's something inside it." I waited for him to explain. Instead, he said something that made my stomach drop. "I already called the police." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "You called the police?" "Because of a wall." Another pause. "Just come," Evan said quietly. "You'll want to see this yourself." The drive from Eugene to Astoria usually takes close to 2 hours. That night, it took less. Rain streaked across the windshield, while the highway curved through dark coastal forest. My mind ran through every possibility it could invent. Old wiring, hidden mold, maybe some long-forgotten storage box. But people don't call the police for mold. When I finally turned onto Birch Hollow Road, the trees along the shoulder glistened under the rain. My headlights swept across the familiar outline of my grandmother's house. And then I saw the lights. Red and blue flashes pulsed against the wet siding and the leaning porch rail. 2 police cruisers sat in the gravel driveway. Evan stood under the porch light with 3 members of his crew. None of them were talking. They were just waiting. I parked at the edge of the drive and stepped out into the cold air. Rain misted across my jacket as I walked up the path. Evan removed his cap when he saw me. "Lena," he said, his voice lower than before. "The officers need to confirm something." 2 police officers stood near the open front door. One of them held a small notebook. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we just need to verify that you're the legal owner of this property." I nodded slowly. My grandmother left it to me. The officer glanced past me toward the living room, where a section of plaster wall had been torn open. Behind it, I could see darkness and something metal reflecting the beam of a flashlight. "All right," the officer said. Then he added words that made the air feel suddenly heavier. "Before we go any further, you should know that whatever's inside that wall may become evidence." The first time I understood that something inside my family had been quietly decided without me was the morning my grandmother's will was read. It was a gray Thursday in the conference room of Pike and Halverson Law, a small estate firm in downtown Astoria. Rain hung in the air, the way it often does on the Oregon coast, and the windows looked out over the Columbia River, where the fog moved slowly between the boats. I remember thinking the room felt too calm. My father, Douglas Hart, sat at the end of the long oak table with the kind of posture that suggested he was attending a routine meeting instead of settling the life of his wife's mother. My mother, Paula Hart, sat beside him with a leather folder in front of her, and both hands folded neatly over it. Across from them was the attorney handling the estate, Gerald Pike. He was in his late 60s, thin, careful with his words, and he had apparently known my grandmother for years. That morning, though he kept his eyes mostly on the paperwork in front of him, I took the chair closest to the door. My grandmother, Marjorie Keene, had died 3 days earlier at 84. The funeral had been small, quiet, the way she would have wanted. She had lived most of her life in Astoria and believed in keeping things simple. But what came after the funeral felt anything but simple. Gerald Pike cleared his throat and opened the folder. Mrs. Keene's estate includes several financial accounts, a family trust, personal jewelry, and real property, he said. My father nodded slightly, as if confirming information he already knew. The lawyer continued reading. The Whitaker Keene Family Trust, including its investment accounts and retirement holdings, would pass to Douglas and Paula Hart as managing beneficiaries. My mother lowered her eyes modestly, though the corner of her mouth lifted for a moment. Next came the jewelry, several pieces that had belonged to my great-grandmother, also to my parents. Then, the small coastal investment property my grandmother had rented out years ago, again to my parents. I kept waiting for my name to appear. Finally, Gerald Pike turned the last page. To my granddaughter, Lena Hart. I leave the property located at 14 Birch Hollow Road, Astoria, Oregon. That was it. No additional accounts, no personal bequests, just the house. The house everyone in the family knew had been sitting empty for years. My father leaned back slightly in his chair. Your grandmother believed in practical decisions, he said in a calm, almost instructional tone. She knew that house meant something to you, my mother added gently. And it gives you a place to start. I didn't argue. At that moment, arguing felt impossible. The truth was, the Birch Hollow house had meant something to me once. When I was a kid, it was where my grandmother baked lemon bread on Sunday afternoons and let me sit at the kitchen table with a stack of old photo albums. But in the last decade, the place had fallen apart. The electrical system had been condemned. The roof leaked during winter. Most of the family talked about it the way people talk about a broken appliance you haven't gotten around to throwing away yet. Gerald Pike slid a single brass key across the table toward me. This is the key to the property, he said quietly. The metal was cool in my hand. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I remembered something. The week before she died, my grandmother had squeezed my wrist while we sat together on the porch of that same house. She had been wearing the thin silver bracelet she always wore, the one she never took off. There are things in that house people forget about, she told me. At the time, I thought she meant memories. Sitting in that quiet law office, I wondered if she meant something else. But I pushed the thought away. Families don't hide secrets inside old houses. At least, that's what I believed that morning. 3 days after the will was read, I drove to Astoria to see the house for the first time in years. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the coastal air cold and sharp. Birch Hollow Road curved along a wooded hill just outside town, the same quiet stretch where my grandmother had lived for most of her life. The place had always felt removed from everything else, far enough from the harbor that the only sounds were wind through the trees and the distant foghorns from the river. When the house came into view, I slowed the car without meaning to. It looked smaller than I remembered. The once white siding had faded to a dull gray, and the front porch leaned slightly to one side, as if the whole structure had grown tired of standing. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and blackberry vines. One of the upstairs windows had been boarded up. For a moment, I stayed in the car. This was the place my parents had decided was enough for me. I finally stepped out and walked up the cracked stone path. The brass key Gerald Pike had given me 2 days earlier felt heavier than it should have in my pocket. When the front door opened, the smell of dust and old wood drifted out to meet me. Inside, the house was exactly the way abandoned places always are, quiet, in a way that feels almost watchful. Furniture was still where my grandmother had left it. The floral couch in the living room, the narrow bookshelf beside the fireplace, even the crocheted blanket she kept folded over the armrest. It was as if the house had been paused in time. I walked slowly from room to room. In the kitchen, the small oak table where we used to eat lemon bread together was still pushed against the window. The wallpaper had begun to peel near the sink, and a dark stain marked the ceiling where the roof had leaked. Upstairs, 2 of the bedrooms had been cleared out years ago, but the third door at the end of the hallway was closed. I remembered that door. My grandmother had always kept that room locked. When I tried the knob, it turned easily. Inside, there was almost nothing, just a narrow bed frame, a dresser, and a single cardboard box in the corner. I crossed the room and opened the box. It held old photographs. Most of them were from decades earlier, family gatherings, birthday cakes, my mother as a teenager, standing on this same porch with my grandmother beside her. Near the bottom of the stack was a picture I didn't recognize. It showed my grandmother, much younger, standing proudly in front of the Birch Hollow house when it was freshly painted and bright. She was holding a baby in her arms. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in my grandmother's neat handwriting, were 6 words: "For Lena, the house remembers." I stared at the sentence longer than I meant to. The words felt deliberate, not sentimental. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I turned instinctively, though there was no one there. That was the moment I noticed something else. The wall beside the dresser looked strange. At first, I thought it was just old plaster, cracking with age. But when I stepped closer, the line of the baseboard didn't quite match the rest of the room. The wall seemed thicker than it should have been. I pressed my palm against it. Solid, but different somehow. I stood there for another minute before finally stepping back. Old houses shift over time, I told myself. Things settle. Walls get repaired. Nothing about it had to mean anything. Still, as I left the room and walked back downstairs, the photograph remained in my hand. For Lena, the house remembers. That night, driving back toward Eugene, with the picture on the passenger seat, I realized something unsettling. If my grandmother had wanted me to forget that house, she wouldn't have written that message, which meant she had wanted me to notice it. I just didn't know what I was supposed to find. 2 days after I found the photograph in the upstairs room, the calls started. I was back in Eugene, sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment with a notepad full of numbers. Estimates for the Birch Hollow house were beginning to arrive, and none of them were encouraging. Roof repairs alone would run close to $15,000. Electrical work could easily double that. The place had been empty too long. My phone rang just as I was trying to decide whether I could realistically afford even the first step. The screen showed my father's name, Douglas Hart. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Dad." His voice came through calm and steady, the way it always did when he believed he was being reasonable. "I was thinking about that house," he said. I didn't say anything. "You've had time to see the condition it's in," he continued. "And I know you're practical enough to realize what kind of money it'll take." Outside my window, traffic moved slowly through the wet Eugene afternoon. "What are you getting at?" I asked. "I'm offering to take it off your hands," he said. The sentence landed in the room like something heavier than it should have been. "You want to buy it?" "I'm trying to help you," he replied. $15,000, cash. That way, you're not stuck with a financial burden you can't handle. For a moment, I looked down at the photograph of my grandmother sitting beside the stack of estimates. $15,000 wouldn't even fix the roof. "I'll think about it," I said. My father paused, as if he had expected a quicker answer. "Well," he said finally, "don't wait too long." He ended the call without another word. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. Paula Hart had always been the softer voice in our family conversations, the one who smoothed over whatever my father had already decided. "Your dad told me he spoke to you," she said warmly. "Yeah, he's just worried about you," she continued. "That house is falling apart, Lena. It could become a real problem if you try to handle it alone." I pictured the warped porch railing and the peeling wallpaper in the kitchen. "I'm just figuring things out," I said. "Well," my mother replied gently, "families usually solve problems together." The words sounded kind on the surface, but something in the tone beneath them made me uneasy. Before hanging up, she added one more sentence. "If you do decide to sell, it's better to keep things within the family." After the call ended, the apartment felt quieter than before. I looked again at the repair estimates spread across the table. Then my eyes moved to the photograph from the cardboard box. For Lena, the house remembers. The message suddenly felt less like a sentimental note and more like a quiet instruction. Late that evening, my phone buzzed once more. A text message. Not from my parents, from Evan Rios, the contractor, who had walked through the Birch Hollow house with me earlier that week. His message was short. "I took another look at that wall upstairs today. Something about it doesn't line up with the rest of the structure." I stared at the words. "What do you mean?" I typed back. His reply came almost immediately. "The wall's thicker than it should be. Old houses settle over time, but this looks deliberate." I read the message twice before setting the phone down. Outside, the rain had started again. If Evan was right, the strange wall in the upstairs room wasn't just age or bad construction. Someone had built it that way. And for the first time since the will was read, I felt the quiet sense that something inside my grandmother's house had been waiting longer than anyone realized. By Friday afternoon, I couldn't sit in Eugene, pretending the Birch Hollow house was just an inconvenient inheritance. Evan's text about the wall had been stuck in my mind for 2 straight days, replaying every time my phone buzzed with another message from my mother or a missed call from my father. The pressure was quiet, but it was constant, like someone slowly tightening a belt you can't see. So I drove back to Astoria. The sky was low and heavy when I arrived, the kind of coastal overcast that makes everything look older than it is. Evan met me at the house with his crew already unloading tools from a white van. He didn't waste time with small talk. I walked through that upstairs room, again, he said, holding a flashlight, even though it was daytime. "The framing doesn't match the rest of the house." "What does that mean?" I asked. He stepped inside and led me up the narrow staircase. The boards creaked under our feet, and the air smelled faintly of damp plaster. In the room at the end of the hall, he pointed his flashlight along the baseboard. "See that line?" he said. "The trim's newer here. Someone replaced it." I crouched down and ran my fingers along the edge. It was subtle, something I would have missed if I hadn't been looking for it. Evan tapped the wall with his knuckles. One section sounded solid. Another section sounded hollow, but too clean, too contained. "This isn't just an old house settling," he said. "It's layered." I stood up slowly, my stomach tightening. "A false wall?" I asked, hearing the phrase even before I believed it. Evan nodded once. In 20 years of doing remodels, he said, I've seen hidden spaces before. Usually it's harmless. A sealed-up doorway, old pipes. Sometimes people hide liquor during Prohibition and never tell anyone. He paused and looked at me. But the way this was done, it was meant not to be noticed. I swallowed and glanced around the small room. The dresser, the empty bed frame, the dusty floor, where my grandmother's box of photos had been sitting. This had been the only room she kept closed. And now, my parents wanted the whole house off my hands. I felt something shift inside me, not into anger, but into clarity. For most of my life, I'd been trained to keep the peace, to accept what was handed to me, to be grateful, even when grateful meant swallowing humiliation. But standing in that room with my grandmother's words still in my memory, the house remembers, I realized peace was just another word for silence. And silence was exactly what my parents depended on. Evan waited, giving me space. "We can leave it alone," he said. "If you don't want to open it, we don't have to." I looked at the wall again. If there was nothing inside, then my parents' behavior still wouldn't make sense. And if there was something pretending it didn't exist, wouldn't protect me. It would only protect them. "Open it," I said. Evan didn't move right away. He studied my face, as if making sure I understood what I was asking for. "All right," he said finally, "but we do it carefully." His crew brought up plastic sheeting, a shop vac, and a sledgehammer they kept for demo work. Evan marked a rectangle on the plaster with a pencil, then switched to a smaller tool. First, slow, deliberate. When the first chunk of plaster came loose, dust drifted into the air like old breath. Behind it, the wooden studs were doubled, 2 layers, a narrow space between them. Evan angled his flashlight into the gap. His expression changed so fast, it was almost frightening. He froze. Then he stepped back, lowering the light. "Lena," he said, voice suddenly tight again, "I need you to stand back." I didn't move. "What is it?" Evan didn't answer right away. He looked down at his phone, then at the opening in the wall. And then he said the last thing I expected to hear. "I'm calling the police." The police arrived less than 20 minutes after Evan made the call. By the time the cruiser pulled into the gravel driveway, the light outside had already begun to fade into the damp gray of an Oregon evening. Evan's crew stood quietly in the front yard, their tools resting against the porch rail, as if no one was quite sure what to do next. Inside the house, the opening in the upstairs wall looked smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. But now I understood why Evan had stepped back. A rectangular steel box sat wedged between the doubled wooden studs. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small briefcase, but it was clearly deliberate. Someone had wrapped it in thick plastic before sliding it into the narrow cavity. It hadn't been placed there by accident. 2 officers entered the house, their boots sounding heavy on the old wooden floor. The older of the 2 introduced himself as Officer Daniel Harper from the Astoria Police Department. He looked first at Evan. "You the one who called?" Evan nodded. "We were doing structural work and found a concealed compartment." Officer Harper turned to me. "And you're the property owner?" "Yes," I said. "My grandmother left the house to me last week." The officer wrote something in a small notebook. Then he followed us upstairs. When he saw the steel box inside the wall, he didn't look surprised so much as cautious, like someone who had learned not to assume what hidden things might be. "All right," he said. "Nobody touches anything until we take a look." His partner used a flashlight to examine the opening. After a moment, he said quietly, "Looks like it's sealed, not locked." Harper nodded. He turned to me again. "Ma'am, we're going to remove the container. Since this is your property, you'll need to be present while we document what's inside. My heart beat faster than it should have. I nodded. Evan stepped forward carefully and loosened the surrounding plaster until the box slid free from the wall. Dust scattered across the floorboards as he lowered it onto a drop cloth. Up close, the metal surface looked old, but well preserved. The plastic wrap had yellowed slightly with age. Officer Harper cut through it with a pocket knife. Inside was a simple latch. He opened it slowly. For a moment, no one spoke. The box wasn't filled with money or jewelry, like some movie version of a hidden treasure. Instead, it held documents. Neatly organized folders tied with thin ribbon, a thick envelope addressed in my grandmother's handwriting, and a smaller velvet pouch resting on top. Harper lifted the envelope first. "Looks like this is meant for you," he said, handing it to me. My hands felt unsteady as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in my grandmother's careful script. "Lena, if you are reading this, it means you were the one who found the wall." I felt the room narrow around the words. The letter continued. "Some people in our family have forgotten that trust is not the same thing as control." My breath caught in my chest. Officer Harper cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am," he said, pointing gently toward the folders in the box, "we're going to need to review these as part of the report." Evan leaned slightly closer to look. One of the folders had a printed title across the tab, Whitaker Keene Family Trust. Another was labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, Bank Transfers, 2018 to 2022. Officer Harper glanced at the titles and then looked at me again. "Your grandmother was keeping records," he said carefully. Downstairs, the wind pushed against the old house, rattling one of the loose windows. I stared at the open steel box. My parents had told me the trust was settled, finished, simple. But if my grandmother had hidden these records inside the walls of her own house, it meant she had believed something very different. And suddenly, the strange urgency in my father's voice, the offer to buy the house, the pressure to sell, didn't feel like concern anymore. It felt like fear. By Monday morning, the house on Birch Hollow Road no longer felt like a forgotten inheritance. It felt like evidence. Officer Harper had taken photographs of everything inside the steel box before allowing me to keep the letter my grandmother had written. The folders themselves were logged as part of an official report and temporarily secured while the department reviewed the documents. He had been careful with his words that night. Sometimes records tell a story, he said. Sometimes they just raise questions. But the moment I left Astoria, I knew one thing for certain. My parents could no longer pretend the house meant nothing. The following afternoon, I received the first sign that they already knew something had changed. I was sitting at my desk in Eugene when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number from Astoria. "Lena Hart," a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes, my name is Renee Callahan," she said. "I'm an attorney representing Douglas and Paula Hart." The words felt oddly formal. I leaned back in my chair. "What can I do for you?" Ms. Callahan's voice remained perfectly measured. "My clients are concerned about recent activities involving the Birch Hollow property. They have been informed that structural work is being performed and that certain materials have been removed from the premises." For a moment, I said nothing. "Your parents told you that I asked. I'm not here to discuss how information was obtained," she replied calmly. "I'm calling to remind you that the Whitaker Keene Family Trust is still subject to administrative review." The phrase made my chest tighten. Meaning what exactly? "It means," she continued, "that any materials potentially connected to trust administration may need to be preserved while the estate is finalized. In other words, they wanted control. Again, I glanced down at the copy of my grandmother's letter lying beside my laptop. My grandmother's will was read last week, I said, carefully. The house was left to me. Yes, Renee Callahan said smoothly. But estate matters are sometimes more complicated than they appear. There was a pause. Then she added something that sounded almost friendly. My clients would strongly recommend avoiding unnecessary construction until all legal questions are resolved. The call ended a minute later. I sat in silence for a long time. My parents had moved quickly, too quickly. They didn't know exactly what had been found inside the wall, but they knew enough to worry. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was my father. His voice was colder than usual. I heard you've been tearing apart that house. I stared out the apartment window at the dark street below. It needed repairs. You should have talked to us first. The word "us" hung in the air. We offered to buy the place, he continued. You chose to ignore that. I said I would think about it. And now you're making things complicated, he replied. I waited for him to say what he actually meant. Instead, he sighed. Lena, he said quietly, sometimes it's better not to dig into things that were already settled. The sentence sent a chill through me, because it wasn't advice. It was a warning. After the call ended, I opened the photo from the upstairs box again. My grandmother stood proudly in front of the Birch Hollow house, the sunlight bright on the siding that was now faded gray. For Lena, the house remembers. I understood something then that hadn't been clear before. My parents believed the house had been a burden, a mistake they could convince me to walk away from. But the moment the wall opened, the burden shifted. Now, they were the ones who had something to lose, and judging by the sudden arrival of their lawyer, they were already trying to stop whatever came next. Wednesday morning arrived gray and quiet in Eugene, but the tension from the previous 2 days hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened. My parents had sent a lawyer within 48 hours of the wall being opened. They had warned me not to continue the work. My father had all but told me to stop asking questions. That kind of urgency didn't come from people who felt confident. It came from people who were afraid of what might be uncovered next. I sat at my kitchen table with the copy of my grandmother's letter beside me and the notes I had taken after speaking with Officer Harper. The police still had most of the folders from the steel box, but before they logged everything into evidence, he had allowed me to photograph several pages for my own records. At the time, I hadn't fully understood what I was looking at. Now I was beginning to. The first page on my laptop screen showed a list of bank transfers tied to the Whitaker Keene Family Trust. Dates, account numbers, amounts. Most of the transfers were large tens of thousands at a time. They stretched back 4 years. At first glance, it looked like ordinary financial movement, the kind of thing that happens inside investment accounts all the time. But one detail kept catching my attention. The destination accounts were unfamiliar. Not brokerage firms, not retirement funds, personal accounts. 3 of them appeared repeatedly. I leaned closer to the screen and read the names attached to the transfers. The first one belonged to Douglas Hart. The second belonged to Paula Hart. The third name took me a moment longer to recognize. G. Pike. I stared at the initials. Gerald Pike had been the attorney who read my grandmother's will. The same man who had calmly slid the brass key across the table and told me the Birch Hollow house was mine. My chest tightened. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Estate attorneys sometimes moved funds during trust management, but the pattern on the screen didn't look like management. It looked like extraction. I scrolled further down. The totals began to add up in a column of numbers that made my stomach turn. By the time I reached the final page, the amount transferred from the trust accounts over 4 years was just under $1.9 million. I closed my eyes for a moment. That number explained the urgency. It explained my father's sudden offer to buy the house. It explained why my parents wanted the walls of Birch Hollow left untouched, because the steel box inside that wall didn't just contain family memories. It contained records, proof. My phone vibrated on the table, interrupting the silence. It was a message from Evan. Police asked me a few follow-up questions this morning, he wrote. They're taking the documents seriously. A second message appeared before I could respond. You might want to talk to someone who understands financial cases. I looked again at the numbers on the screen. For the past week, I had been reacting, responding to my parents' pressure, their lawyers' warnings, the sudden discovery inside the wall. But reacting wasn't enough anymore. If the records in my grandmother's box were real, this wasn't just a family argument about inheritance. It was something else, something much bigger. I opened my contacts and searched for the name Evan had suggested earlier that morning, Renee Callahan. Until yesterday, she had been my parents' attorney, the voice reminding me to stay quiet. But what she had said on the phone kept echoing in my head. Estate matters are sometimes more complicated than they appear. Maybe she already knew that. Maybe she had seen the numbers too. And if that was true, then the next move in the story wasn't going to happen inside my parents' living room. It was going to happen in a place where records mattered more than family loyalty. I picked up the phone and started dialing. Thursday morning, I flew back to Astoria. Not because I wanted to be near my parents, and not because the old house suddenly felt comforting. I went because the documents were there, and because Officer Harper had called the night before with a single sentence that didn't sound casual. "We need you to come in," he said, in person. At the station, Harper met me in a small interview room with a thin folder in his hands. The fluorescent lights made everything look too sharp. My tired eyes, the wrinkles in my jacket, the worry I couldn't fully hide anymore. He wasn't alone. A woman in a navy blazer sat at the table beside him. Her hair was pinned back neatly, and she had the calm, careful posture of someone who worked cases, not arguments. "Ms. Hart," she said, standing. "I'm Special Agent Marisol Velez." The words, "Special Agent," made my stomach drop. Harper gestured for me to sit. "We contacted federal partners because of what we're seeing in the trust records," he said. Agent Velez opened a notebook. "Your grandmother's documents indicate repeated transfers from a trust account into private accounts," she said evenly. "Some of those transfers cross state lines." I swallowed. "So, what does that mean?" "It means it may not stay local," she replied. "Financial crimes tied to trusts can become federal, depending on the scope." Harper slid the thin folder toward me. Inside were copies of the pages I had photographed. Only now they were highlighted, labeled, and organized in a way that made the pattern unmistakable. Douglas Hart, Paula Hart, G. Pike, and below the names, the totals. Agent Velez watched my face as I read. "We've also requested the trust bank to freeze any remaining movement while we confirm authorization," she said. My heart hammered. "You can do that if there's probable cause to believe funds were misappropriated," she said yes. In the hallway outside the interview room, I heard footsteps and distant voices. Normal police station sounds that suddenly felt like the background to something much larger than my family. Harper leaned forward slightly. "We reached out to Mr. Pike. He's cooperating." The sentence hit hard. Gerald Pike wasn't just my grandmother's attorney. He was the one who had made the whole situation feel official, clean, final. He said the transfers were part of routine trust management, Harper continued. But when we asked for supporting documentation, he couldn't produce it. Agent Velez closed her notebook. "We're going to subpoena those records," she said. "And if the signatures don't match, that changes everything." I thought of my grandmother's letter. Trust is not the same thing as control. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. "Do my parents know?" I asked. Harper didn't answer immediately. "Not yet," he said finally. "But they will." When I left the station, the sky over Astoria was clear for the first time all week, bright enough to make the river look like polished metal. I drove straight to Birch Hollow Road. Evan was there waiting on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't ask for details. He just nodded once when he saw my face. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Inside, the upstairs wall was still open, the cavity exposed, like a wound that refused to close. I stood there staring at the space where the steel box had been hidden, and I realized something unsettling. My grandmother hadn't hidden those documents because she wanted revenge. She'd hidden them because she knew the only way to stop people like my parents was to give the truth a place to survive. And now that truth had finally made it out of the wall. The system had heard it, and it was waking up. It took 4 months for everything to unfold. Investigations move slowly, even when the evidence is clear. Subpoenas had to be issued. Bank records had to be verified. Signatures had to be compared, line by line, against older documents. But by early autumn, the truth my grandmother had hidden in the wall of her house was no longer a private discovery. It was a case. The official findings came through the federal prosecutor's office in Portland. The Whitaker Keene Family Trust had been systematically drained over several years through unauthorized transfers. The documents inside the steel box matched the bank's internal records almost perfectly. The signatures authorizing the transfers did not belong to my grandmother. They belonged to someone imitating her. The investigation named 3 people responsible: my father, my mother, and Gerald Pike. Pike's law license was suspended almost immediately after the charges were filed. He agreed to cooperate once the financial trail became impossible to explain. The bank accounts tied to the trust had already been frozen weeks earlier. By the time the legal process moved forward, most of the missing funds had been traced, nearly $1.9 million. That number had once been hidden inside quiet spreadsheets and private transfers. Now it appeared in court documents. My parents never called me again after the charges became public. The only time I saw them was during a short hearing in Portland, where the judge approved a settlement that returned the remaining assets to the trust. They looked smaller somehow, not weaker exactly, just exposed. The kind of exposure that happens when a story people believed for years finally collapses under the weight of the truth. I didn't feel triumph watching it happen, only a strange, steady calm. Because the moment the steel box came out of that wall, the outcome had already begun. Justice had simply taken time to catch up. A few weeks later, I returned to Birch Hollow Road with Evan to finish the repairs that had been interrupted. The house looked different now. Not perfect. Old houses never become perfect, but the roof no longer leaked, and the upstairs room had been rebuilt with a proper wall where the hidden compartment used to be. Before closing it completely, I stood in the empty space one last time. The place where my grandmother had hidden her documents was just wood and plaster again, but the message she left behind stayed with me. The house remembers. I understood now. that she hadn't meant the building itself. She meant the truth. Truth has a strange way of waiting patiently until someone is ready to see it. And when that moment comes, it doesn't need revenge. It only needs light. I kept the photograph from the cardboard box in the thin silver bracelet my grandmother had worn for most of her life. Everything else, every dollar that had been recovered from the trust, was returned to the account she created. But the Birch Hollow house stayed with me. Some evenings I sit on the repaired porch and watch the fog move slowly through the trees, the way it did when I was a child. The house no longer feels like a burden someone handed me. It feels like the place where a story finally told the truth. And sometimes that's enough to begin again. If you've ever faced a moment when the truth inside your own family was hard to uncover, you're not alone. Feel free to share your thoughts or experiences below. Many people find strength in hearing each other's stories. And if this story stayed with you, consider liking and subscribing. And you're welcome to listen to the next story waiting just ahead.